In this upcoming clip of Noam Chomsky, he speaks on the Vietnam and Iraq wars and addresses the public's lack of knowledge about the human cost of these wars in several ways. Chomsky argues that the media and government often downplay civilian casualties and portray wars as necessary and winnable. This creates a public perception that doesn't reflect the true human cost. Now off to this wonderful clip, and following will be a couple more points Chomsky makes on propaganda.
Professor Chomsky, you've been a leading critic of U.S. imperial wars in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and you've also spoken about how many Americans, when asked, how many people died in the war in Vietnam, I think answered 200,000, and you said it's actually closer to 3 to 4 million, and compared this to a denial of the Holocaust. And yet since the first Iraq war, through the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the sanctions, it's estimated that about 6 million Muslims have died in the Middle East through US bombing campaigns. What does that tell us, and how do we steer this country in another direction away from violence?
Well, I think the situation is a little bit worse than what you described. The main study of estimates of Vietnamese dead was 100,000, and that was in a university setting, which is in a liberal, very liberal community, in an elite university. What you'd get if you asked this question across the country, I have no idea. It hasn't been done. But that was 100,000, which is a tiny fraction of the number of Vietnamese who died. During the war itself, it was probably close to 4 million, and many are continuing to die from the effects of chemical warfare. We don't know how many. So it is very much like Holocaust denial. Somebody who said that, if in Germany, at an elite university, people were asked how many Jews died in the Holocaust, and they said, say 100,000. You think there's a problem in Germany, a cultural, social, educational problem. And that's something that we have to face. Going on to Iraq, there was a sanctions. You mentioned the sanctions. This is before the war. This is under Clinton, not Bush. Under Clinton, there was a sanctions program administered by the UN, but of course it was a U.S. program. The administrators of the program were distinguished international diplomats. The first one, Irish, resigned in protest because he described the sanctions as genocidal. He didn't want to be part of it. The second one, Hans von Sponeck, also a distinguished international diplomat, stayed on for who incidentally, both of them had detailed information about what was happening in Iraq. They had investigators all over the place. They certainly knew more about Iraq than the CIA, which admittedly is not a terribly high bar, but probably had the best information about Iraq of any Westerners. And von Sponeck also was completely appalled. After a few years, resigned in protest, charged that they were genocidal, and went on to write a book, an important book, called A Different Form of War. You probably haven't read the book or heard about it. And one of the reasons is it wasn't mentioned in the United States. No reviews, no commentary, scholarship doesn't refer to it. It's a detailed examination, very close examination of the way the sanctions were were destroying the society, carrying out what he called genocide, killing hundreds of thousands of people, and furthermore, strengthening the tyrant. People were compelled to rely on Saddam's fairly efficient rationing system simply to survive. if that hadn't, I'm now going beyond von Sponeck. I've talked to him about it, actually, and he pretty much agrees that it's very likely that this saved Saddam from being overthrown from within, which has happened to dictators over and over. Somoza, Marcos, Mobutu, Ceausescu, one after another has been overthrown by popular movements within, even though they were brutal and harsh dictators. It might very well have been the fate of Saddam, but he was strengthened by the sanctions which were carrying out virtual genocide, in von Sponeck's words, against the population that was forced, that was decimated and forced to simply rely on him for survival. Do we know anything about this? Like I say, the book that details it is unknown, not reviewed, not mentioned. Well, that's a particular form of the nationalist pathology that Chris was talking about, as is the horrifying case of the estimate of the toll that our war took in Vietnam. And you can add this in case after case. Just take a look at today's newspapers. Huge uproar about what's called a caravan of people from Central America coming to the United States, according to our leader, an invasion of the country. He's sending 1,000 troops down there. It's about one soldier for every child in the caravan. Who are these people? These are people fleeing from regions that we destroyed. Reagan's wars in Central America were vicious and brutal. Hundreds of thousands of people killed, masses tortured, widows, orphans, every form of atrocity you can think of. Trump, in fact, is imitating his hero Reagan with his hysteria, building up hysteria about the invasion from Central America. You may recall that in 1985, Ronald Reagan strapped on his cowboy boots and declared a national emergency because the Nicaraguan army was 2 days' march from Harlingen, Texas, just about to overwhelm us. And the country was terrified, just as many people are terrified now. This, for whatever reason, is probably the most frightened country in the world, has been for a long time. I don't know if that corresponds to your experience, but I've seen nothing like it elsewhere. And it doesn't take much for the most ridiculous claim to be made. And this is a case where people are not just fleeing, but fleeing from what recreated. It's not just Reagan's wars, which were bad enough. Most of them are coming from Honduras. Why Honduras? It's been a pretty awful state for many years because of long-term U.S. intervention and domination. But something happened in 2009. There was a mildly reformist president, Mel Zelaya. He was kicked out in a military coup. He was condemned all over Latin America and most of the world, with one notable exception. The Obama administration would not call it a military coup for a very simple reason. If you call it a military coup, you're forced by congressional legislation to terminate military aid to the military junta that's ruling it. So therefore, for Obama, it wasn't a military coup. Honduras very quickly turned into a real horror chamber, the homicide capital of the world. Then came a fake election under the military junta. It was condemned by the Organization of American States, by Latin American countries. Again, one exception. It was praised by the United States as a move towards democracy. That just increased the horrors and the terror. End result, people fleeing. And therefore we cringe in terror because we're being invaded by these miserable families fleeing from horror and destruction. That's form of nationalism, which is pretty hard to describe.
In Chomsky's book Manufacturing Consent, he argues that powerful institutions like media conglomerates manipulate public opinion to support foreign interventions. This manipulation can limit the public's access to information about the war's true costs. Chomsky might point out how media coverage often focuses on American casualties, while the far greater number of Vietnamese and Iraqi deaths receive less attention. This can create a sense of asymmetry and distance from the war's true impact. Well, I hope you liked the video and give the channel a subscribe. You can now join the channel as a member if you wish. Now, take care and bye-bye.